I'm sitting here inside the First Baptist Church of Pine Valley, alone after 60 years. My name is Helen Rose Carter, and I'm 84 years old. These wooden pews still creak the same way they did when I was 18, back in 1958. The smell of old wood and dust fills my nostrils, mixing with memories I've tried so hard to bury. You might wonder why an old woman like me would come back to this empty, abandoned church on a Tuesday afternoon. Why I'd drive my old pickup truck down this dirt road just to sit in the same front pew where my family used to pray every Sunday morning. The truth is, I've been carrying a secret for 60 years. A secret so heavy it nearly killed me to keep it. A secret about Pastor Samuel Whitmore, the man this community called a servant of God. A secret about what happened in that little office behind the altar, where he said he was helping me with my sins. But today, sitting here with my worn-out Bible in my lap, I'm not that scared 18-year-old girl anymore. Today, I'm here to tell you what really happened. And maybe, just maybe, if you're listening to this story, it's because God wants you to know that He never abandons anyone. Not even when the men who speak in His name hurt us the most. Pine Valley, Georgia, in 1958 was the kind of small town where everybody knew everybody, and the church bell was louder than any clock you could buy. My daddy, Robert Carter, worked at the sawmill, and my mama, Mary Rose, took care of our little house on Elm Street with the white picket fence and the rose garden she was so proud of. We weren't rich folks, but we had everything we needed, including a faith that ran as deep as the roots of those old oak trees lining Main Street. Every Sunday morning, you'd find the Carter family in the front pew of First Baptist Church, right here where I'm sitting now. Mama in her best dress with the pearl buttons, Daddy in his only good suit, and me in whatever hand-me-down dress my cousin Sarah had outgrown. Pastor Samuel Whitmore had been preaching at our church for about 3 years when this story begins. He was a tall man, maybe 45 years old, with silver hair that caught the light streaming through these stained glass windows. He had a way of speaking that made you feel like God was talking directly to you, and when He looked at you, really looked at you, it felt like He could see straight into your soul. The whole congregation loved him. The women would bring him casseroles and the men would invite him to go fishing down at Miller's Creek. My mama used to say that Pastor Whitmore was heaven sent, especially after he helped the Jenkins family when their barn burned down, and organized food drives for the colored families on the other side of town during the hard winter of 1957. I was 18 that year, fresh out of high school, working part-time at Henderson's General Store and dreaming about maybe going to nursing school up in Atlanta. But those dreams felt so far away from Pine Valley, like trying to reach the moon with a stepladder. Most girls my age were already married or engaged, and I felt this pressure, to figure out my life. That's when my mama got sick. Cancer, the doctors said, though back then people whispered that word like it was a curse. She started losing weight, losing her appetite, and some days she couldn't even get out of bed to tend her roses. I watched my strong, faithful mama shrink down to nothing, and for the first time in my life, I started having doubts about God. Why would He let someone as good as Mary Rose Carter suffer like that? Why weren't our prayers working? These were dangerous thoughts for a girl raised in Pine Valley, Georgia, where questioning God was almost as bad as questioning your daddy. But I couldn't help myself. The doubts kept coming, especially during those long nights when I'd sit by Mama's bedside, watching her struggle to breathe, listening to her whisper prayers that seemed to disappear into the ceiling like smoke. When Mama died in September of 1958, just as the leaves were starting to turn, I felt like my whole world cracked right down the middle. The funeral was held right here in this church, with Pastor Whitmore speaking about God's mysterious plan and how Mama was dancing with the angels now. But all I could think about was how unfair it was, how angry I was at God for taking the best woman I'd ever known. After Mama's funeral, I felt like I was drowning in my own doubt. Sunday mornings became torture. I'd sit in this same pew, listening to Pastor Whitmore preach about God's love and mercy, but all I could feel was this hollow ache in my chest where my faith used to be. The hymns that once lifted my spirit now sounded like lies. Amazing Grace felt like cruel irony. How sweet the sound. There was nothing sweet about watching your mama waste away while you begged God to save her. Daddy threw himself into work at the sawmill, staying late every night like he was afraid to come home to a house that still smelled like Mama's lavender soap. We barely spoke to each other anymore. Grief had built a wall between us, and neither one of us knew how to tear it down. I'd cook his dinner, he'd eat in silence, and then we'd both retreat to our separate corners of sorrow. I started having what I now know were panic attacks, though back in 1958, we didn't have fancy names for such things. We just said someone had nervous spells. My heart would race during church services, my palms would sweat, and I'd feel like I couldn't breathe. Sometimes I'd have to excuse myself and step outside just to keep from fainting right there in the pew. The other church ladies started whispering about me. Mrs. Henderson said maybe I needed to find a good husband to settle me down. Mrs. Patterson suggested I wasn't praying hard enough. But the worst part was that I started to believe them. Maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe my doubt was a sin so terrible that God was punishing me by taking away my peace. I tried reading Mama's Bible, the one with her handwritten notes in the margins, but the words just swam around on the page like they were written in a foreign language. I tried praying, but it felt like talking to an empty sky. I even tried going to the cemetery every day after work, sitting by Mama's grave and asking her to help me find my way back to God. But the dead don't answer, and I was left alone with questions that felt too dangerous to ask out loud. That's when the real problem started. See, in Pine Valley, if you were struggling with your faith, there was only one person you were supposed to turn to. Only one man who could guide you back to the light. Pastor Samuel Whitmore was not just our preacher, he was our spiritual doctor, our confessor, our direct line to understanding God's will. Everyone said so. When you were lost, you went to Pastor Whitmore. When you were confused, you went to Pastor Whitmore. When you were an 18-year-old girl whose faith was crumbling like old mortar, and whose mama was dead, and whose daddy couldn't look at her without seeing his wife's ghost, well, you went to Pastor Whitmore too. Because that's what good Christian girls did in Pine Valley, Georgia. They trusted their pastor to show them the way. They believed that a man of God would never lead them astray. And that trust, that beautiful, innocent, dangerous trust, is exactly what predators count on. It was a cold October Sunday when everything changed. I remember because the heater in the church wasn't working properly, and we could all see our breath during the opening hymn. Pastor Whitmore was preaching about faith in times of trouble, using Job as his example, talking about how God tests those he loves most. I sat there listening, but instead of comfort, I felt like he was talking directly about me, like somehow he knew about my struggles, my doubt, my anger at God for taking Mama. After the service, while folks were filing out and talking about Sunday dinner plans, Pastor Whitmore approached me near the altar. He put his hand on my shoulder in that fatherly way that made everyone in Pine Valley trust him, and he said, "Helen Rose, I've been watching you these past few weeks, and I can see you're carrying a heavy burden." His voice was soft, concerned, the same tone he used when visiting sick parishioners. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. If Pastor Whitmore could see my spiritual struggle, then probably everyone else could too. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Pastor," I whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Ever since Mama died, I just can't seem to find my faith anymore. Sometimes I wonder if God even hears me when I pray." He nodded like he understood completely, like this was the most natural thing in the world. "Sweet Helen Rose," he said, and the way he said my name made me feel special, chosen somehow. "What you're experiencing is more common than you think. The enemy likes to attack us when we're most vulnerable, when we've suffered loss. But God has not abandoned you, child. He's simply testing your faith, seeing if you're strong enough for the special purpose He has planned for your life." Special purpose. Those words lit up something inside me that had been dark for weeks. Maybe my suffering meant something after all. Maybe God hadn't forgotten about me. I want to help you, Helen Rose, Pastor Whitmore continued, his hand still warm on my shoulder. But this kind of spiritual warfare requires more than what we can accomplish in a few minutes after Sunday service. Would you be willing to meet with me privately for some intensive biblical counseling? I have some special techniques for dealing with spiritual doubt that I learned in seminary. The word seminary carried so much weight in Pine Valley. It meant education, authority, a direct connection to God's wisdom. When your pastor suggested something he learned in seminary, you didn't question it. You felt honored to receive such specialized spiritual care. I could meet with you Thursday evenings, he said. After regular church activities are finished, when we can have privacy for deep spiritual work. My office behind the altar would be perfect. We could study scripture together, pray together, and I could teach you some advanced meditation techniques that will help you reconnect with God's voice. I felt a flutter of hope for the first time in months. Here was Pastor Whitmore, this respected man of God, offering to spend his valuable time helping me find my way back to faith. Offering to use special knowledge he'd gained in seminary just for me. It felt like a miracle, like God was finally answering my prayers by sending his servant to guide me through my darkness. Would Thursday at 7 o'clock work for you? He asked. I know your father works late at the sawmill, so you could drive yourself to church without disturbing anyone. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs. The emphasis on privacy. The special treatment. The way he'd noticed my father's schedule. But at 18, grieving my mama and desperate for spiritual guidance, I saw only kindness. I saw only a pastor who cared enough about my soul to offer extra help. Yes, Pastor Whitmore, I said, and I remember feeling grateful, even blessed. Thank you so much for caring about me. I'll be there Thursday at 7. He smiled then, and squeezed my shoulder one more time. God has great plans for you, Helen Rose Carter. I can feel it. These sessions will be exactly what you need to become the strong Christian woman he's calling you to be. That Thursday evening, I drove Daddy's old Ford pickup to the church just as the sun was setting behind Miller's Creek. The building looked different in the evening light, more mysterious somehow, with shadows stretching long across the cemetery next door. I had spent the last 4 days feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness about my special counseling session. Part of me felt chosen, blessed to receive such personal attention from Pastor Whitmore. But there was another part, a small voice in the back of my mind, that felt uneasy about something I couldn't quite name. I parked behind the church like Pastor Whitmore had suggested, near the back door that led directly to his office. For privacy, he had explained. We don't want folks interrupting our spiritual work with small talk and social visits. That made sense to me. Deep spiritual counseling wasn't the same as regular church socializing. When I knocked on his office door, he welcomed me with that warm smile that made everyone in Pine Valley feel special. The office was small and dimly lit, with just a desk lamp casting a circle of yellow light. He had arranged 2 chairs close together, he said, so we could share his Bible and study the scriptures more effectively. Helen Rose, he said as I settled into my chair, before we begin our spiritual work, I want you to understand something important. What happens between us in these sessions is sacred, a holy confidence between you, me, and God. It would be inappropriate, even spiritually dangerous, to discuss our private counseling with others who might not understand the depth of your spiritual crisis. I nodded, though something about that warning made my stomach flutter strangely. But he was the pastor, trained in seminary, chosen by God to lead our congregation. If he said our sessions needed to be private, then that must be the right way to handle such serious spiritual matters. We started by reading from the book of Job, with Pastor Whitmore explaining how Satan had asked God's permission to test Job's faith through suffering. Just like Job, Helen Rose, you've been chosen for testing. Your mother's death, your spiritual doubt, your feelings of abandonment by God, these are all part of a divine plan to strengthen your faith and prepare you for something greater. His hand rested on mine as he spoke, and I noticed how warm and soft it was, not like Daddy's work-roughened hands or the boys my age who worked at the sawmill. "But Pastor," I said, "sometimes I feel so angry at God. Sometimes I wonder if He even exists. Isn't that sinful? Isn't that exactly what Satan wants?" Pastor Whitmore leaned closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Sweet Helen Rose, those feelings prove that God is working in your life. The fact that Satan is attacking your faith so fiercely means you have something special that he wants to destroy. We just need to build up your spiritual defenses, strengthen your relationship with God through intensive prayer and meditation." Then he asked me to close my eyes and let him guide me through what he called contemplative prayer. He placed his hands on my shoulders and began to pray out loud, asking God to drive out the spirits of doubt and rebellion that were tormenting me. His hands felt heavy and warm, and when his prayers mentioned casting out demons of sensuality and feminine weakness, I felt confused and embarrassed. I didn't understand why those particular demons would be relevant to my grief over Mama's death. But again, he was the pastor. He understood spiritual warfare in ways that an 18-year-old girl couldn't comprehend. As the weeks went by, these Thursday evening sessions became a regular part of my life. Pastor Whitmore said my case was more serious than he had initially thought, that the enemy had a particularly strong hold on me because of my feminine susceptibility to emotional deception. He explained that women, being the weaker vessel spiritually, needed more intensive guidance to maintain their faith, especially young women who had been through trauma. During our sessions, he would have me confess my thoughts, my dreams, even my feelings about boys and marriage. He said that total honesty was necessary for complete spiritual healing, that holding back even small secrets would give Satan a foothold in my soul. I found myself telling him things I had never told anyone, private thoughts that made me blush to speak out loud. Sometimes during our prayer time, his hands would rest on my arms, my back, sometimes my neck, as he asked God to drive out the spirits of doubt and fear. He explained that physical touch was an important part of spiritual healing, that Jesus himself had laid hands on those he healed. When I felt uncomfortable or confused by some aspect of our sessions, Pastor Whitmore would remind me that my discomfort was evidence of spiritual resistance, proof that we were making progress against the demonic influences in my life. "Helen Rose," he would say, "if our sessions were not effective, Satan would not be fighting so hard against them. Your feelings of confusion and unease are exactly what we would expect when confronting such deep spiritual bondage." And so I convinced myself that my growing discomfort was actually a good sign, evidence that God was working in my life through Pastor Whitmore's ministry. After all, he was a man of God, trained in seminary, respected by our entire community. Who was I, a grieving teenager with obvious spiritual problems, to question his methods or doubt his motives? By November, our Thursday evening sessions had been going on for almost 2 months, and Pastor Whitmore said he was seeing real spiritual progress in my life. He told me that my case was more complex than most, that the combination of grief, feminine emotional instability, and what he called generational spiritual weaknesses required a more intensive approach than traditional counseling. "Helen Rose," he said during one particularly cold Thursday evening, "I've been praying about your situation, and God has revealed to me that we need to move to the next level of spiritual healing. You've made good progress with basic scripture study and prayer, but there are deeper layers of spiritual bondage that can only be addressed through more advanced techniques." I felt both honored and nervous. Advanced techniques sounded important, serious, like the kind of specialized ministry that only the most skilled pastors could provide. But I also felt that familiar flutter of unease in my stomach, the same feeling I got when he talked about our sessions needing to remain completely private. "What kind of advanced techniques, Pastor?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound book that looked much older and more formal than our regular church Bible. "This is a special ministerial manual that I received during my advanced seminary training," he explained. "It contains scriptural methods for dealing with what we call deep spiritual contamination, particularly in young women who have been exposed to worldly influences. The way he said worldly influences made me feel ashamed, though I wasn't sure what worldly influences he meant. I had lived in Pine Valley my whole life, attended church every Sunday since I was born, and barely even talked to boys my own age. But Pastor Whitmore seemed to know things about my spiritual condition that I didn't understand myself. He began reading from the manual, explaining that according to ancient biblical practices, certain types of spiritual cleansing required what he called laying on of hands in specific scriptural patterns. He showed me verses about Jesus touching people to heal them, about the disciples placing hands on new believers, about the importance of physical contact in spiritual ministry. The human body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, he said, but it can also harbor spiritual contamination that affects our relationship with God. Young women, especially those who have experienced trauma like the loss of a parent, are particularly susceptible to these spiritual attachments. As he spoke, Pastor Whitmore stood up and moved behind my chair. "I'm going to demonstrate the proper biblical technique for spiritual cleansing," he said, his voice taking on that special tone he used during the most serious parts of our sessions. "This may feel unusual at first, but remember that many of God's healing methods seem strange to our human understanding. Think about Naaman having to wash in the Jordan River 7 times, or Jesus using mud and spit to heal blind eyes." His hand settled on my shoulders, and he began to pray in a voice that was barely above a whisper. The prayer was unlike anything I had heard in regular church services. He asked God to cleanse the feminine vessel, to purify the temple from contamination, and to drive out spirits of sensuality and rebellion that cling to young women's bodies. I felt deeply uncomfortable, but I also felt deeply ashamed of that discomfort. Here was Pastor Whitmore, using advanced biblical techniques he had learned in seminary, trying to help me with serious spiritual problems, and all I could think about was how his touch made me feel confused and wrong. Clearly, my discomfort was evidence of exactly the kind of spiritual contamination he was trying to heal. "Helen Rose," he said softly, his hands moving in what he called scriptural patterns across my shoulders and arms, "I can feel the spiritual resistance in your body. The enemy does not want to give up his hold on you. But we must persevere." This is exactly the kind of intensive ministry that Paul wrote about when he talked about wrestling against spiritual wickedness in high places. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to focus on the prayer, tried to feel the spiritual cleansing he was describing. When his touch moved to areas that made me want to pull away, he would remind me that my resistance was demonic, that true spiritual healing often required us to surrender our human understanding and trust completely in God's methods. "This is how the early church dealt with such problems," he explained during a pause in the prayer. "Before modern churches became worldly and watered down the gospel, they understood that serious spiritual warfare required serious methods. Most pastors today don't have the training or the courage to provide this level of spiritual care." I felt privileged and ashamed at the same time. Privileged that Pastor Whitmore considered me worthy of such specialized ministry, but ashamed that I needed it, ashamed that I was so spiritually contaminated that regular prayer and Bible study weren't enough. Over the following weeks, these advanced spiritual cleansing sessions became a regular part of our Thursday meetings. Pastor Whitmore explained that consistency was crucial, that missing even one session could allow the spiritual contamination to return stronger than before. He also reminded me repeatedly that sharing details of these sessions with anyone else would be spiritually dangerous, not just for me, but for whoever I told. "People who don't understand advanced spiritual warfare," he said, "could misinterpret what we're doing here. They might think it was inappropriate, not realizing that we're following biblical patterns that are thousands of years old. Their misunderstanding could actually give Satan a foothold in their own lives." And so I kept our secret, convincing myself that my growing sense of wrongness was actually evidence that the sessions were working, that Pastor Whitmore was fighting a real spiritual battle for my soul. I told myself that the sick feeling in my stomach was demons being cast out, that my desire to run away was spiritual resistance that needed to be overcome through submission and faith. Winter turned to spring, and then spring turned to summer, and still our Thursday evening sessions continued. Pastor Whitmore said my case was proving to be more challenging than he had initially expected, that the spiritual contamination in my life had deeper roots than most young women experienced. God is using your situation to teach me new things about spiritual warfare, he told me one evening in June. You're helping me become a better pastor, Helen Rose. Your willingness to submit to this difficult process is actually a ministry to our entire congregation. I had learned to disconnect my mind during our sessions, to float somewhere above my body while Pastor Whitmore performed what he called intensive scriptural cleansing. I would recite Bible verses in my head, or plan what I would cook Daddy for dinner, or remember stories Mama used to tell me about her childhood. Anything to avoid thinking about what was actually happening in that dim office behind the altar. But the hardest part wasn't the sessions themselves. The hardest part was walking back into regular life afterward, pretending to be the same Helen Rose Carter that everyone in Pine Valley thought they knew. Sunday mornings were the worst. I would sit in our family pew, 3 rows behind where Pastor Whitmore's wife Elizabeth sat with their 2 young children, and listen to him preach about purity and holiness and God's plan for Christian families. Mrs. Whitmore was everything a pastor's wife should be: quiet, dignified, always dressed modestly with her hair pinned up neat and proper. She taught the women's Sunday school class and organized the church socials and visited sick parishioners with homemade soup. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me with a kind expression, and I would wonder what she would think if she knew what her husband was doing to me every Thursday evening. Would she believe me? Would she hate me? Would she think it was my fault somehow? The other young women in our church had started getting married that summer. Sally Henderson married Tom Patterson in a beautiful ceremony right here in this sanctuary, with Pastor Whitmore performing the service and talking about the sacred bond between husband and wife. Martha Jenkins got engaged to a boy from the next county, and everyone was excited about planning her fall wedding. Even my cousin Sarah, 2 years younger than me, had started walking out with the Miller boy, and everyone expected an engagement announcement soon. I felt like I was watching normal life through a window, seeing all these happy, innocent girls moving forward into the futures they had dreamed about, while I remained stuck in Pastor Whitmore's office, trapped in what he called our sacred work together. Daddy had started asking questions about why I seemed so tired all the time, why I had lost my appetite, why I startled so easily when he came up behind me. "Helen Rose," he said one evening over supper, "you've been different since your mama died. I know we're both grieving, but this goes beyond grief. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to see Doc Morrison?" I wanted so desperately to tell him everything. To break down crying and explain why I couldn't sleep at night, why I felt sick to my stomach most of the time, why I flinched when men touched me, even in innocent ways like shaking hands after church. But Pastor Whitmore had explained very clearly what would happen if I ever broke our confidence. He said that people wouldn't understand, that they would blame me for leading a man of God astray, that they would say I was trying to destroy a good pastor's reputation because I was spiritually rebellious. "Think about it, Helen Rose," he had said. "Who would people believe? A respected pastor with a seminary education and a beautiful family, or a troubled young woman who everyone knows has been struggling with doubt and emotional problems since her mother died?" He was right, and I knew it. In Pine Valley, Georgia, in 1959, a girl like me didn't accuse a man like Pastor Whitmore of anything. That kind of accusation would destroy not just me, but Daddy too. People would whisper that Robert Carter couldn't control his own daughter, that he had raised a girl who would lie about a servant of God. So I told Daddy I was fine, just still adjusting to life without Mama, and he seemed to accept that explanation. But I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. That July, Mrs. Patterson approached Daddy after church with what she called a wonderful opportunity. Her nephew, David Patterson, had recently moved back to Pine Valley after finishing his military service. He was 26 years old, had a steady job at the bank, and was looking for a good Christian wife to settle down with. Helen Rose is such a sweet girl, Mrs. Patterson told Daddy while I stood there pretending to study the church bulletin. And David needs a wife who understands the importance of faith and family. I think they would make a lovely match. The idea of an arranged meeting terrified me, but it also offered something I desperately wanted, a way out. If I could marry David Patterson, I could move into my own house, away from Pine Valley, away from Thursday evening sessions, away from Pastor Whitmore's office. Marriage might be my escape route, my chance to start over somewhere new. I think that sounds like a fine idea, Daddy said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. He had been worried about me for months, and the prospect of seeing me settled with a good man seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders. So I began walking out with David Patterson, a quiet man with kind eyes and gentle manners who treated me like I was made of precious china. He would pick me up for Sunday afternoon drives, and we would talk about safe topics like the weather and church activities and his plans for the future. David was everything a girl was supposed to want in a husband: steady, respectful, financially secure, and devoted to his faith. But when he held my hand or kissed my cheek goodnight, I felt nothing but a terrible emptiness. Pastor Whitmore, meanwhile, seemed very interested in my courtship with David. During our Thursday sessions, he would ask detailed questions about our conversations, our physical interactions, my feelings about marriage. "It's important that you enter marriage pure and uncontaminated," he would say. "Our work together is preparing you to be the kind of wife that a godly man deserves. David Patterson is getting a treasure, thanks to the spiritual cleansing we've accomplished together." He made it sound like the abuse was a gift, a form of preparation that would make me a better wife. Like David should be grateful for what Pastor Whitmore was doing to me, though of course David would never know about it. By August, David had asked Daddy for permission to marry me, and Daddy had enthusiastically agreed. We set the wedding date for October, which gave us time to prepare and for David to find us a small house in the next county where we could start our life together. I threw myself into wedding preparations with a desperate kind of energy, focusing on dress fittings and menu planning and flower arrangements because concentrating on those details kept me from thinking about everything else. Mrs. Whitmore helped with the preparations, offering advice about household management and married life with the gentle wisdom of an experienced pastor's wife. "Marriage is a beautiful thing, Helen Rose," she told me while we looked through pattern books for my wedding dress. "God designed it as a sacred partnership between a man and woman. You and David are going to be so happy together." I smiled and nodded and tried to imagine being happy, tried to picture a future where I could wake up in the morning without feeling sick, where I could go to church without my heart racing, where I could touch and be touched without wanting to disappear. But even as I planned my escape through marriage, Pastor Whitmore reminded me that our spiritual work was far from complete. "The closer you get to your wedding, Helen Rose, the more intense Satan's attacks will become," he warned. "He doesn't want to lose his hold on you. We need to increase the frequency of our sessions to make sure you're completely cleansed before you become David's wife." And so instead of our sessions ending as my wedding approached, they intensified, happening twice a week, sometimes 3 times. Pastor Whitmore said it was crucial that I enter marriage completely free from spiritual contamination, that anything less would be unfair to David and dishonoring to God. Everything started unraveling on a Wednesday evening in late September, just 3 weeks before my wedding to David Patterson. I had been to see Pastor Whitmore the night before for what he called pre-marriage purification, and I woke up that morning feeling like my skin was crawling with invisible insects. I couldn't eat breakfast, couldn't focus on my work at Henderson's General Store, couldn't even look at the wedding dress hanging in my bedroom without feeling like I was going to vomit. David had planned to take me to dinner at Miller's restaurant that evening to finalize some last-minute wedding details, but when he picked me up at 6 o'clock, one look at my face told him something was terribly wrong. "Helen Rose, honey, you look pale as a ghost," he said, genuine concern in his voice. "Are you feeling all right? Maybe we should postpone dinner and get you home to rest." But I couldn't go home. Daddy would ask questions I couldn't answer, and besides, Our little house felt like a trap lately, every corner reminding me of Mama and how disappointed she would be if she knew what her daughter had become. "No, David, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that felt like breaking glass. "Just wedding nerves, I suppose. Every bride gets them, right?" We drove to Miller's restaurant in David's clean Buick, making small talk about the weather and the guest list, but I could feel him glancing at me with growing worry. During dinner, while he talked about the little house he had rented for us in Oakville and his plans for our future together, I found myself staring at his hands as he cut his pot roast. They were clean hands, honest hands, hands that had never touched me with anything but respect and gentleness. And suddenly, without any warning, I started crying. Not delicate tears that a proper young lady might shed, but huge, body-shaking sobs that I couldn't control. David dropped his fork and reached across the table to take my hand, his face full of alarm. "Helen Rose, sweetheart, what's wrong? Please tell me what's happening." The words almost came out then. I almost told him everything, right there in Miller's restaurant with half the town watching. I almost said, "David, I can't marry you because Pastor Whitmore has been." But then I imagined his face changing from concern to disgust, imagined him standing up and walking away, imagined the whole restaurant buzzing with whispers about crazy Helen Rose Carter who was making up evil stories about their beloved pastor. "I'm scared," I finally managed to say, which was true, just not in the way David thought. "I'm scared about being a good wife, about leaving Daddy alone, about everything changing." David's relief was visible. Wedding nerves he could understand and comfort. "Oh honey," he said, squeezing my hand gently. "Every bride feels that way. My sister Sarah told me she cried for a week before her wedding. It's perfectly normal to be nervous about such a big change." But Mrs. Henderson, who was sitting 2 tables away with her husband, had noticed my breakdown and came over to check on us. "Helen Rose, dear, are you all right?" she asked in that concerned voice that older women used when they sensed trouble. "You've seemed so tired lately, so unlike yourself. Is there anything we can do to help?" "She's just got wedding nerves," David explained quickly, protective of my privacy. "Nothing that a good night's sleep won't cure." But Mrs. Henderson kept studying my face with the sharp eyes of a woman who had raised 4 daughters and knew the difference between wedding nerves and real distress. "Helen Rose," she said quietly, "if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands what young women go through, you know where to find me. Sometimes it helps to have another woman to confide in." The way she said confide made my heart race. Did she suspect something? Had someone seen me at the church on Thursday evenings? Had Pastor Whitmore been careless somehow? I managed to thank her and assure her I was fine, but for the rest of the evening, I felt like everyone in Miller's restaurant was watching me, wondering what secret I was hiding. David drove me home in worried silence, and when we reached my front porch, he took both my hands in his and looked directly into my eyes. "Helen Rose, I love you, and I want to spend my life taking care of you. But if there's something wrong, something you need to tell me before we get married, I hope you know you can trust me with anything. Anything at all." For one terrifying moment, I thought he knew. I thought somehow he had figured out what was happening to me, and I felt both relief and absolute panic at the same time. But then he kissed my forehead gently and said, "I just want you to be happy, sweetheart. Whatever is troubling you, we can face it together after we're married." The week after my breakdown at Miller's restaurant, Pastor Whitmore called an emergency session. He said he could sense that I was experiencing what he called pre-marriage spiritual warfare, and that Satan was making one final attempt to destroy my purity before I became David's wife. "Helen Rose," he said as I sat in his office that Thursday evening, "Mrs. Henderson mentioned to my wife that you seemed very distressed at dinner the other night. We can't allow gossip and speculation to interfere with the important work we're doing together." The way he said it made my blood run cold. It wasn't concern for my well-being, it was a warning. He was reminding me that people were watching, that any unusual behavior on my part could raise questions that would be dangerous for both of us. But mostly dangerous for me. I need you to understand something very clearly, he continued, his voice taking on that authoritative tone he used when discussing serious spiritual matters. We are now in the most critical phase of your spiritual cleansing. The enemy knows that once you're married to David, you'll be protected by your husband's spiritual covering, and it will be much harder for demonic forces to access you. So Satan is pulling out all his weapons right now, trying to make you doubt the work we've been doing, trying to fill your mind with confusion and fear. He stood up and moved behind my chair, placing his hands on my shoulders in the gesture that had become so familiar and so dreaded. That's why these final sessions before your wedding are so crucial. We need to complete your purification process, seal you spiritually so that you can enter marriage completely clean. But I wasn't feeling clean. I was feeling filthy, broken, like something essential inside me had been shattered beyond repair. Every time David kissed me goodnight, I wanted to scrub my lips with lye soap. When he talked about our future children, I wanted to tell him that I was too damaged, too contaminated to be anyone's mother. The nightmares had started in August and were getting worse every week. I would dream that I was drowning in the baptismal pool while Pastor Whitmore held me under the water, or that I was standing at the altar in my wedding dress while the whole congregation pointed and whispered about what a fraud I was. Sometimes I would wake up screaming, and Daddy would come running to my room asking what was wrong. Just bad dreams, Daddy, I would say. Wedding nerves, I guess. But they weren't wedding nerves. They were the dreams of a girl whose soul was being murdered a little bit more every Thursday evening, who was being forced to smile and plan a future that felt as real as smoke. David had noticed the change in me too. Our conversations became strained because I couldn't focus on anything he was saying. When he talked about the house we would live in, or the children we might have, or the life we would build together, I felt like he was describing someone else's future, someone who deserved happiness and normalcy and love. Helen Rose, he said to me one evening as we sat on Daddy's front porch, I'm worried about you. You seem so far away lately, like you're not really here with me. Are you having second thoughts about our marriage? Because if you are, it's better to tell me now than to go through with a wedding you don't want. The kindness in his voice almost broke me. Here was this good man, this decent man who had never hurt anyone in his life, offering me a way out if I wanted it. And part of me did want it. Part of me wanted to call off the wedding, pack a bag, and run as far away from Pine Valley as I could get. But where would I go? What would I do? In 1959, a young woman who broke an engagement without a very good reason became the subject of endless gossip and speculation. And I couldn't give anyone the real reason without destroying not just Pastor Whitmore, but his wife and children too. Elizabeth Whitmore was a good woman who had never done anything wrong except marry a monster. Their little boy Jimmy was 7 years old and their daughter Susan was just 5. What would happen to them if their daddy's reputation was destroyed? What would happen to our church, to all the good work it did in the community? No, David, I said, taking his hand and forcing myself to smile. I'm not having second thoughts. I'm just nervous, that's all. Every bride gets nervous before her wedding. But the lies were eating me alive from the inside out. I had lost 15 pounds since summer, weight I couldn't afford to lose. My wedding dress had to be taken in twice. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time, and I had developed a nervous habit of picking at my fingernails until they bled. Daddy started leaving articles from magazines about women's nerves on the kitchen table, subtle suggestions that maybe I should see a doctor or take some kind of medicine to help with my anxiety. Mrs. Patterson, David's aunt who had arranged our introduction, made several comments about how thin I was getting, how important it was for young wives to keep their strength up for the duties of marriage and motherhood. Even the church ladies started whispering about me. I could see them glancing at me during Sunday services, murmuring to each other behind their church vans. Mrs. Jenkins told Daddy that I looked peaked and suggested I might need a tonic. Mrs. Miller asked if I was eating enough, if maybe the stress of planning a wedding was too much for a girl who had already been through the trauma of losing her mother. The irony was bitter and sharp. All these good women, these caring neighbors who had known me since I was born, could see that something was terribly wrong with me. But none of them could imagine the real cause. None of them could conceive that their beloved pastor, the man they trusted with their deepest spiritual needs, could be the source of my destruction. Pastor Whitmore, meanwhile, seemed to take satisfaction in my deteriorating condition. "The worse you feel right now, Helen Rose, the more it proves that we're winning the spiritual battle for your soul," he would say during our sessions. "Satan always fights hardest just before he's defeated. Your suffering is evidence that the spiritual contamination is being driven out of your body." 2 weeks before the wedding, I finally reached my breaking point. I was standing in Henderson's general store, trying to help a customer find the right size of mason jars, when suddenly the walls started closing in on me and I couldn't breathe. My vision went black around the edges, my heart started racing like a runaway train, and I collapsed right there between the canned goods and the fabric bolts. When I came to, Dr. Morrison was kneeling beside me with his medical bag, taking my pulse and looking very concerned. "Helen Rose, when was the last time you ate a full meal?" he asked. "When was the last time you slept through the night?" I couldn't answer either question honestly. Mr. Henderson drove me home, and Dr. Morrison followed to talk to Daddy about my condition. I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling while they discussed my nervous exhaustion in hushed voices downstairs. "Robert," I heard Dr. Morrison say, "that girl is on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. I've seen it before in young women who have been through too much stress. The death of her mother, the pressure of getting married, the responsibility of taking care of you, it's too much for someone her age to handle." They decided that I needed rest, proper nutrition, and what Dr. Morrison called a change of scenery. He suggested that maybe David and I should consider postponing the wedding until I was stronger, until I had time to recover from whatever was causing my physical and emotional collapse. But Pastor Whitmore, when he heard about my fainting spell, had a different interpretation. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he told Daddy when he came to check on me the next evening. "Helen Rose is experiencing what we call spiritual crisis right before her wedding. It's not uncommon for young women who have been through intensive spiritual cleansing to have this kind of reaction when the process is almost complete." The night that changed everything happened exactly 1 week before my wedding to David Patterson. I had driven to the church for what Pastor Whitmore said would be our final purification session before I became a married woman. October air was crisp and cold, and the leaves on the oak trees around the church had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was that after next Thursday, these sessions would finally be over. I would be Mrs. David Patterson, living in Oakville, far enough from Pine Valley that I could start pretending this had never happened. I parked behind the church as usual and walked toward Pastor Whitmore's office, but when I got to the back door, I heard voices coming from inside. My hand froze on the doorknob as I recognized the second voice. It was Sarah Jenkins, my 16-year-old neighbor who lived 3 houses down from Daddy and me. Sarah was a sweet girl, just a junior in high school, with long blonde braids and freckles across her nose. She had been struggling lately because her father had started drinking heavily after losing his job at the sawmill, and her mother was pregnant again with what would be their 6th child. "I don't understand, Pastor Whitmore," I heard Sarah saying through the thin office door, her voice high and scared. "I thought you wanted to help me with my doubts about God, not this." "Sarah, sweet child," came Pastor Whitmore's familiar voice, using that same gentle, authoritative tone he had used with me 2 years ago. "What you're feeling is spiritual resistance. The enemy doesn't want you to receive the kind of intensive spiritual care that your situation requires. Young women from troubled homes like yours are particularly susceptible to demonic influence." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I pressed my ear against the door, hardly daring to breathe, as Pastor Whitmore continued with words I had heard so many times before. Your father's drinking, your mother's depression, the poverty and chaos in your home, all of this has left you spiritually vulnerable. We need to cleanse you of these generational curses before they destroy your future the way they've destroyed your family. But Pastor, Sarah's voice was shaking now, this doesn't feel like prayer. This feels wrong. I want to go home. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Pastor Whitmore's voice became firmer, more commanding. What we're doing here is based on ancient biblical practices that most modern churches don't have the courage to use anymore. I learned these techniques in seminary, from professors who studied the original Greek and Hebrew texts. This is how the early church dealt with serious spiritual contamination. I heard the sound of a chair creaking, footsteps moving around the small office. Your discomfort is evidence that we're making progress against the demonic forces in your life. If this weren't working, Satan wouldn't be fighting so hard against it. Your desire to leave is actually proof that we need to continue. Then I heard something that made my heart stop completely. Sarah started to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears of a young woman receiving spiritual counseling, but the desperate, frightened sobs of a child who was trapped and confused and scared. Please, Pastor Whitmore, she whispered. I want my mama. I want to go home. Sarah, his voice was getting closer to her, your mama sent you to me because she trusts me to help you. If you run away now, if you tell people you couldn't handle the spiritual discipline required for your healing, what do you think that will do to your family's reputation? Your father already has a drinking problem, your mother is struggling to hold things together. Do you really want to add more shame to their burdens? The manipulation was exactly the same. The same threats disguised as spiritual concern, the same way of making the victim feel responsible for protecting other people, the same twisting of scripture and authority to justify the unjustifiable. But hearing it being done to Sarah, sweet 16-year-old Sarah who still played with dolls and helped her mama with the younger children, broke something open inside me that I didn't even know existed. For 2 years, I had convinced myself that somehow I deserved what was happening to me. That maybe I had done something to encourage it, or that my spiritual condition was really so dire that these extreme measures were necessary. I had told myself that Pastor Whitmore was trying to help me, even if his methods felt wrong. But Sarah didn't deserve this. Sarah was innocent in a way that I had forgotten how to be. Sarah was the girl I had been before Pastor Whitmore got his hands on me, and I could not, would not, let him destroy her the way he had destroyed me. I turned the doorknob as quietly as I could and pushed the door open just a crack. What I saw made me feel like someone had driven a knife straight through my chest. Sarah was sitting in the same chair where I had sat for 2 years, her young face streaked with tears, her school dress rumpled and disheveled. Pastor Whitmore was standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders, exactly the way he had stood behind me so many times, speaking in that low, hypnotic voice about spiritual cleansing and biblical authority. The laying on of hands is a sacred practice, Sarah, he was saying. Jesus himself used physical touch to drive out demons and heal the spiritually sick. Your body is a temple that needs to be purified before you can serve God properly. Sarah's whole body was shaking. She looked like a trapped animal, desperate to escape but too frightened and confused to know how. And in that moment, looking at her terror and innocence, I finally understood what Pastor Whitmore really was. He wasn't a man of God struggling with human weakness. He wasn't a spiritual healer using advanced biblical techniques. He was a predator who used his position and our faith against us, who fed on young women's trust and confusion and desperate need to believe that their suffering meant something. He was evil wearing the mask of godliness, and he had been destroying girls like Sarah and me for God only knew how long. I pushed the door open all the way and stepped into the office. Sarah, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, your mama is looking for you. She sent me to bring you home. Pastor Whitmore spun around, his face going white when he saw me standing there. Sarah jumped up from the chair like she had been shocked, relief flooding her features when she saw a familiar face. Helen Rose, she cried, rushing toward me. Oh, Helen Rose, I'm so glad you're here. I was scared and I didn't know what to do. I put my arms around Sarah and held her tight, feeling her trembling against me like a frightened bird. Over her head, I looked directly into Pastor Whitmore's eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't afraid of him. I was furious. Sarah needs to go home now, I said, my voice carrying an authority I didn't know I possessed. Her family is worried about her. Pastor Whitmore tried to regain control of the situation. Helen Rose, you don't understand what's happening here. Sarah is receiving important spiritual counseling that her mother specifically requested. It would be inappropriate for us to stop in the middle of such serious spiritual work. But I was done being manipulated by his words, done pretending that what he did in this office had anything to do with God or healing or help. No, I said simply. Sarah, get your books. We're leaving right now. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I walked out of Pastor Whitmore's office with my head held high, with sweet Sarah Jenkins safe beside me, and with the absolute certainty that I was finally doing the right thing. I drove Sarah home in Daddy's pickup truck, both of us silent until we reached her family's small house on Maple Street. Before she got out, she turned to me with tears still wet on her cheeks. Helen Rose, she whispered, was I doing something wrong? Pastor Whitmore said I was spiritually contaminated, that my family's problems were affecting my soul. Was he telling the truth? Looking at her innocent face, her confusion and self-doubt, I felt something crack open in my chest. This sweet child was asking the same questions I had tortured myself with for 2 years, wondering if she was somehow to blame for what a grown man was doing to her. No, Sarah, I said firmly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. You weren't doing anything wrong. Nothing at all. What Pastor Whitmore was doing to you, that's not how God works. That's not how real pastors help people. Her relief was immediate and visible. I knew it felt wrong, she said. But he's a pastor, and my mama always said we have to trust men of God, and I thought maybe I was just too weak or sinful to understand. Listen to me, Sarah Jenkins, I said, using the voice my mama used to use when she wanted to make sure I understood something important. You are not weak, and you are not sinful, and you never have to let anyone touch you in ways that make you feel scared or confused, pastor or not. Do you hear me? She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Will you tell my mama what happened? I don't think she'll believe me if I tell her myself. That question hit me like a physical blow. Tell her mama? That would mean telling the truth about Pastor Whitmore, out loud, to another adult who might ask questions and demand answers. It would mean breaking the silence that had protected him and destroyed me for 2 years. But looking at Sarah's face, I knew I didn't have a choice anymore. Yes, I said. I'll tell her. And Sarah? If anyone ever makes you feel scared or confused like that again, you run. You run straight home and you tell the first adult you trust, okay? After Sarah went inside, I sat in that truck for a long time, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to figure out what to do next. I thought about going home, pretending this had never happened, going through with my wedding to David next week and moving to Oakville where I could start fresh. But I kept seeing Sarah's terrified face, kept hearing her ask if she was doing something wrong. How many other girls had sat in that chair before me? How many others would sit there after Sarah if I did nothing? The next morning, I called off work at Henderson's General Store and spent the day walking around Pine Valley, thinking about every young woman who had ever mentioned receiving spiritual counseling from Pastor Whitmore. There was Emma Patterson, who had seemed different after her parents sent her for help with what they called rebellious attitudes. There was Ruth Miller, who had stopped coming to church activities after Pastor Whitmore said she needed intensive prayer for feminine spiritual weaknesses. There was Mary Beth Johnson, who had moved away suddenly after high school and never come back to visit, not even for her own father's funeral. I started with Emma Patterson because she was married now and living in town with her husband. When I knocked on her door that afternoon, her face went pale the moment I mentioned Pastor Whitmore's name. "I don't know what you're talking about, Helen Rose," she said quickly, glancing around like someone might be listening. "Pastor Whitmore never did anything inappropriate. He's a good man, a godly man. Whatever you think happened, you're mistaken." But her hands were shaking as she spoke, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. When I pressed gently, telling her about Sarah and about my own experiences, she slammed the door in my face. "I won't listen to lies about a servant of God," she called through the wood. "And if you're smart, you'll keep such wicked thoughts to yourself." Ruth Miller had a different reaction. When I found her at her parents' farm and carefully, quietly told her why I had come, she started crying so hard she couldn't speak for 10 minutes. "I thought I was the only one," she finally whispered. "I thought there was something wrong with me, something that made him think I needed that kind of help. I've been carrying this shame for 3 years, Helen Rose. 3 years of thinking I was dirty and broken and unfit for any decent man's attention." By evening, I had talked to 5 young women. 2 denied everything and warned me to stop spreading lies. But 3 others, including Ruth, confirmed what I already knew, that Pastor Whitmore had been using his position to abuse young women in our community for years, maybe since he first arrived in Pine Valley. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called David Patterson and told him we needed to postpone the wedding. I didn't explain why, not yet, but I told him something serious had come up that I needed to handle before I could think about marriage. "Helen Rose, whatever it is, we can face it together," he said, his voice full of love and concern. "You don't have to handle anything alone anymore." "I know, David," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But this is something I have to do by myself first. Something I should have done a long time ago." The week that followed was the loneliest of my entire life. Word spread through Pine Valley faster than wildfire. In August, Helen Rose Carter had made accusations against Pastor Whitmore, terrible accusations that no decent Christian woman should even think, much less speak out loud. The reaction was swift and brutal. Mrs. Henderson banned me from the general store, saying she couldn't have someone spreading vicious lies about a man of God working around decent customers. Mrs. Patterson told everyone who would listen that the stress of losing my mother had clearly driven me to some kind of nervous breakdown, that I was making up stories to get attention. Even Mrs. Jenkins, Sarah's own mother, came to our house to tell Daddy that I was filling her daughter's head with wicked fantasies, and that if I didn't stop, she'd have to contact the sheriff about harassment. Daddy aged 10 years in those 7 days. He sat at our kitchen table every evening, staring at his untouched supper, trying to understand how his quiet, obedient daughter had suddenly become the center of the biggest scandal Pine Valley had seen in decades. "Helen Rose," he said to me on Wednesday night, his voice heavy with exhaustion and confusion, "I need you to help me understand what's happening here. These are serious accusations you're making. Pastor Whitmore has been a pillar of our community for 5 years. He's married to Elizabeth, has 2 young children, leads our church with dignity and wisdom. Are you absolutely certain about what you're saying?" I looked at my daddy's weathered hands, hands that had worked so hard to provide for Mama and me, hands that were now shaking slightly as he tried to process what his daughter was telling him about their pastor. "Yes, Daddy," I said quietly. "I'm certain. I know how hard this is to believe, but I'm telling you the truth." He was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the church steeple visible in the distance. "If what you're saying is true," he finally said, "then I failed you. I failed to protect my own daughter. I sent you to that man for spiritual guidance, and his voice broke. "Helen Rose, if I failed you that badly, I don't know how I'll live with myself." "You didn't fail me, Daddy," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "He fooled everybody. That's what makes him so dangerous." But even Daddy's support couldn't shield me from what was happening in the rest of the community. David Patterson came to see me on Friday evening, his face grave and troubled. Helen Rose, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, he said as we sat on the front porch swing. Are you absolutely sure about these accusations against Pastor Whitmore? Because if you're not, if this is some kind of nervous breakdown or female hysteria brought on by wedding stress, we can get you help. Dr. Morrison knows doctors in Atlanta who specialize in women's conditions. The fact that even David, who loved me, who had promised to stand by me through anything, was questioning my sanity rather than Pastor Whitmore's innocence showed me exactly how impossible my situation was. In Pine Valley, Georgia, in 1959, a pastor's word was worth more than a young woman's truth, especially a young woman who everyone already thought was emotionally unstable. I'm sure, David, I said simply. I understand if you can't marry someone who's caused this kind of trouble in the community. I understand if your family doesn't want to be associated with scandal. He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he said, Helen Rose, I love you. But I also love my family, my reputation, my position at the bank. If we go through with this marriage now, in the middle of all this controversy, it could affect everything I've worked for. That was the moment I realized I was truly alone. Not just isolated from the community, but abandoned by the man who had promised to love and protect me. Even the 3 young women who had initially confirmed my story began to change their minds under pressure from their families. Ruth Miller's parents sent her to stay with relatives in Alabama until the scandal died down. Emma Patterson publicly recanted her statement, saying she had been confused and manipulated into making false accusations. By the end of the week, it was just me and Sarah Jenkins against the entire community, and Sarah was only 16 years old. Her parents were considering sending her away too, partly to protect her from what they saw as my bad influence, and partly because having their daughter involved in such a scandal was bringing shame on their family. I spent hours sitting by Mama's grave, talking to her headstone like she could hear me. Mama, I would whisper, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. I don't know if telling the truth was the right thing to do if it's just going to destroy everybody's lives and change nothing. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about giving up, about taking back my accusations and disappearing quietly, I thought about the next young woman who would sit in Pastor Whitmore's office, confused and frightened and alone. I thought about how many girls he had already damaged, and how many more he would damage if someone didn't stand up to him. Even if that someone was just me. The miracle started small, the way most miracles do. It began with Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore herself. 3 weeks after I had made my accusations public, she appeared at our front door on a Tuesday morning, her usually perfect hair disheveled, her eyes red from crying. Daddy was at work, so it was just me and her standing in our little living room, 2 women on opposite sides of an impossible situation. Helen Rose, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did my husband really do the things you've been saying he did? I looked at this woman who had every reason to hate me, whose life I had turned upside down with my accusations, whose children were now being whispered about at school, whose marriage was hanging by a thread because of words I had spoken. Yes, ma'am, I said quietly. He did. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, but yes, he did. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. I found something, she said. In Samuel's desk at home. Letters. Letters from young women, thanking him for his special spiritual guidance. Letters describing things that no pastor should ever be doing with parishioners. Her hands were shaking as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of envelopes. There are 12 letters, Helen Rose. 12 different girls, spanning back almost to when we first came to Pine Valley. Some of them I recognize, girls who suddenly stopped coming to church, or who moved away, or who got married quickly and never spoke about their time receiving counseling from Samuel. I felt like the room was spinning. 12 letters. 12 young women who had suffered the same way I had, who had carried the same shame and confusion and pain. Mrs. Whitmore, I said, I know this must be destroying you. I know you must hate me for bringing this to light. She looked up at me then, and her eyes were full of a pain so deep it took my breath away. Helen Rose, I don't hate you. I hate that it took so long for someone to be brave enough to speak up. I hate that my husband fooled me for 5 years while he was hurting young women in our community. And I hate that you had to carry this burden alone for so long because the rest of us were too blind to see what was right in front of us. That same afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore went to the church deacons with the letters and with my testimony. By evening, an emergency meeting had been called. Pastor Samuel Whitmore was confronted not just with my accusations, but with written evidence from a dozen victims spanning 5 years. The next Sunday, our pulpit stood empty. Pastor Whitmore had been quietly removed from his position and had left Pine Valley with his family in the middle of the night, like thieves fleeing before dawn. No explanation was given to the congregation, just an announcement that, due to personal circumstances, Pastor Whitmore would no longer be serving our church. But word spread anyway, the way truth always does in small towns. Within days, more women began to come forward. Women who had been too frightened to speak when it was just my word against his, but who found courage when they realized they weren't alone. Martha Jenkins, who was now 23 and married with a baby, admitted that Pastor Whitmore had abused her when she was 15. Rebecca Patterson, Emma's younger sister, revealed that her spiritual counseling 3 years ago had left her so traumatized she had tried to take her own life. Even Ruth Miller came back from Alabama to add her voice to ours. The miracle wasn't just that Pastor Whitmore was gone. The miracle was that we found each other. For the first time in years, none of us was carrying this burden alone. We had each other to talk to cry with, to help each other understand that what had happened to us wasn't our fault. Dr. Morrison, who had always been a kind man, started what he called conversation groups for women who had experienced trauma. We met in his office every Thursday evening, the same night I used to dread more than anything else in the world. But now Thursday evenings became about healing instead of harm, about speaking truth instead of swallowing lies. David Patterson came to see me 6 weeks after Pastor Whitmore left town. Helen Rose, he said, his face full of shame and regret, I owe you an apology. I should have believed you from the beginning. I should have stood by you when it mattered most. I accepted his apology, but I didn't take him back. Some bridges, once burned by betrayal, can't be rebuilt with sorry words. The miracle was bigger than just removing one predator from one church. The miracle was that we learned to believe each other, to support each other, to speak up for each other. The miracle was that other churches in other counties started asking harder questions about their own pastors when word spread about what had happened in Pine Valley. And that brings me back to where I started, sitting here in this empty church, 60 years later, no longer afraid of these walls or the memories they hold. The sun is setting through those same stained glass windows, casting colored light across the wooden pews where I learned to pray as a child, where I lost my faith as a young woman, and where I eventually found it again in a deeper, truer way. After Pastor Whitmore left, our congregation struggled for a while. Some families moved away, unable to handle the shame of what had happened in their church. Others stayed but found it hard to trust again, hard to believe that spiritual authority could be genuine and safe. We went through 3 interim pastors before we found Reverend Margaret Williams, a gentle woman in her 50s who understood that a wounded congregation needed time and patience to heal. It was Reverend Williams who taught me that faith and church aren't the same thing, that God and the men who claim to speak for him aren't the same thing either. She helped me understand that what happened in Pastor Whitmore's office had nothing to do with real Christianity, real spiritual care, or the real God who loves his children too much to let them be hurt in his name. I never did marry David Patterson. Instead, I became something that Pine Valley had never seen before, a woman who lived alone by choice, who built a life around helping other women find their voices and their strength. I moved to Atlanta, went to nursing school like I had always dreamed, and spent 30 years working with women who had survived various kinds of trauma. But I always came back to Pine Valley for holidays and special occasions, watching our little town slowly learn to do better, to ask harder questions, to protect its children more carefully. The church has a new pastor now, a young man named Reverend Thomas who preaches about love and justice and standing up for the vulnerable. The congregation includes several women who survived Pastor Whitmore's abuse, all of us grandmothers now, all of us still supporting each other through life's challenges. Sarah Jenkins became a teacher and never married, dedicating her life to education and protecting children. Ruth Miller became a social worker. Emma Patterson became a nurse like me. We all found ways to turn our pain into purpose, our survival into service. I'm 84 years old now, and my hair is white as snow, and my hands shake when I hold my coffee cup. But I'm not that terrified 18-year-old girl anymore, drowning in shame and silence. I'm a woman who learned that sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it hurts, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. The church bell still rings at 6 o'clock every evening, just like it did 60 years ago. But now when I hear it, I don't think about fear or manipulation or the abuse of power. I think about justice, about courage, about the miracle of women finding their voices and using them to protect each other. I think about the God who was never the problem, it was always the men who claimed to speak for him while doing the devil's work. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself in it, if you're sitting in your own version of Pastor Whitmore's office, being told that your discomfort is spiritual resistance, that your fear is evidence of demonic influence, that speaking up would hurt innocent people, please hear me when I say this: it is not your fault, it never was your fault, and you deserve so much better than the lies you're being told. The men who abuse their spiritual authority count on our silence, on our shame, on our belief that we somehow brought this on ourselves. They count on us protecting their reputations more than we protect our own souls. But here's what I learned at 84 years old, sitting in this church where my nightmare began and my healing eventually flourished: God never asked you to sacrifice your safety for anyone else's reputation. God never asked you to endure abuse in the name of spiritual growth. And God certainly never authorized anyone to hurt you while claiming to speak for him. The miracle in my story wasn't just that Pastor Whitmore was removed from his position. The miracle was that we found each other, we found our voices, and we learned that sometimes the most Christ-like thing you can do is expose the wolves who dress up like shepherds. If my story has touched your heart, if it's given you courage or hope or just the knowledge that you're not alone, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling other survivors that they matter, that they're believed, that they're not alone. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of women who found their strength in the darkest places, who turned their pain into purpose, who discovered that sometimes breaking your silence is the most sacred thing you can do, please subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. Because every woman deserves to know that her voice matters, her truth matters, and her healing matters. God was never the problem, friends. It was always the men who lied about speaking for him. And it's time we stopped letting them get away with it.